to commemorate 75 years of independence, the University of Pennsylvania, Institute for Advanced Study of India, and India Review Journal hosted a web conference. Academic Director of the University of Pennsylvania Institute for Advanced Study of India and Editor-in-Chief of the India Review Journal, Dr. Ishar Judge Ahluwalia, and editor of the India Review Journal and professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Anthony Chiruli, were present. From Bangladesh there was Afroja Shoma, and the name of her paper was Partition Through Popular Media, Perspectives from Bangladesh.
Greetings from Dhaka, honorable organizers, dear co-panelists, and the audience. Good evening to you all. Many thanks to the India Review and the University of Pennsylvania Institute for the Advanced Study of India for making me a part of this wonderful event. I was born after 3.5 decades of the partition of India. My maternal grandmother, Rabia, was a 7 or 8-year-old kid during that time of mayhem and madness. In my childhood, I overheard her saying, "Amra to Assam desher manush aslam," meaning we people were Assamese. During the partition, her father, Abdul Jabbar, moved to Sunamganj, a place in Sylhet region in Bangladesh. I could remember in my childhood, quite a few times, I overheard my maternal grandparents and paternal grandmother talking about partition, homestead, Hindu and Muslim people who come to this side or went to the other side of the border. However, to me, partition of 1947 was nothing than a mere information, as I was not aware of what does partition mean at all. I couldn't even relate to that event. I was born after nearly 1.5 decades of the liberation war of Bangladesh. I have heard ample of true stories of the war of 1971 from my grandparents, parents, teachers, neighbors, and people who I met in everyday life. So it was way more than only an information. We were living the memories of the war. In our childhood, we saw songs, movies, poems, celebration of national days, TV programs in remembrance of 1971. Even as a child, I felt 71 is something very close to my heart. Nationally, that's how I was grown. Back in my school days, there was an annual event called Jemon Khushi Temon Sajo, meaning dress you like. In that annual event, every year, we used to see students portraying the characters of Mukti Jodha, meaning freedom fighters, and Mukti Jodhar Ma, meaning mother of a martyred freedom fighter who was in anguish and looking for her lost son. So, Mukti Juddha has always been a part of our everyday life, while partition was totally absent and unspoken. Could we call this absence of partition a selective amnesia? Well, you think about it. By this time, let me tell you about Hrithik Ghatak's film. Already Amit Ranjan, he mentioned Hrithik's name. So a staggering image from Hrithik's movie, Komal Gandhar, pierced my heart, helped me to connect to the wound of the partition emotionally, and forced me to think about the partition time and time and again. I was a graduate student then, doing my film appreciation course during that period, watching all the works of the legendary Bengali filmmaker Hrithik Ghatak. Komal Gandhar was the part of a trilogy directed by Ghatak, centering the concept of the partition. In that movie, there was a scene where a rail line that used to connect two parts of Bengal once was broken after the partition. Standing beside that rail track, the central female character, Onushua, by pointing her finger to the other side of the river Padma, was saying that, you see, the light there? Somewhere in that area is my village. I could see it, but can't go there. That very moment in the film instantaneously numbed my soul and triggered my interest in the partition. However, Ritik is not a Bangla filmmaker as he is an Indian Bengali. His ancestral home is in Old Town in Dhaka though. The way how Manto and his literature bears the pain of the partition, Ritik and his movies carry the wound and agony of the partition the same way. We are observing 75th anniversary of the partition. Do you know how many movies Bangladesh has produced on the partition so far? Only 3. After 7 decades of this significant event, we could name only 3 that were produced from Bangladesh. These are Chitra Nodir Pare, meaning on the bank of River Padma, Hacha, The Cage, Deshantor, The Exodus. Another film named Palonko was jointly produced by Bangladesh and India. That's all. There are no other films on this apocalyptic event. While we could name 4 fiction films, to the best of my knowledge, we have only 2 documentaries that portrayed this communal conflagration. Shimanto Rekha, meaning the borderline, a 2.5-hour length documentary by Tanvir Mokammel. In that film, Mokammel presents the background and the costs of the partition. He tracked down a few of the Hindu people who moved to India from East Bengal and interviewed them and bring back their opinion, their perspective from victims' perspective. The other documentary's name is Bhobar Bhita, meaning the homestead of Bhoba. Bhoba was Ritik Ghatok's nickname. In this 10-minute length documentary, the director Molla Sagar searched for the ancestral homestead of Ritik Ghatok in Old Town in Dhaka, which Ritik left during the partition. Film scholar Dr. Fahmidul Haq recently published an article on the partition movies produced from Bangladesh, which was published by India Review. He identified in that article that in Bangladeshi cinema, there is an absence of 1947 and abundance of 1971. Not only in films, absence of the partition is also a reality in Bangladeshi literature. Last year, I did a research on Bangladeshi novels centering the concept of partition of India and the liberation war of Bangladesh. While I was looking for the samples, I realized that the number of novels focusing on the partition were only a few. On the contrary, the number of novels on liberation war were incomparably high. Ranga Prabhat, meaning the bright dawn, by Abul Fazl was one of the earliest novels on the partition written in Bengali in East Pakistan in early 50s. To name some of the other novels on the theme are Nongor by Abu Rushd, Agun Pakhi by Hasan Azizul Haq, Kalo Borof by Mahmudul Haq, Ichamotir Epar Opar by Abdul Mannan Soyod, Khelaram Kheleja by Soyod Shamsul Haq, and Gayatri Shondha by Selina Hussain. Niyaz Zaman, in her book, A Divided Legacy, remarks that, I quote, most partition novels sustain a Hindu-Muslim romance which breaks up during the communal tensions of partition or because the lovers are separated. Quote ends. She also notes that, I quote, some writers who witnessed violence choose not to talk about it. While this is generally the case with Bengali writers who use the riots to describe the attempt at building a new homeland or on finding a new home. However, after scrutinizing 5 novels focused on the partition, my previously mentioned research found themes and subthemes such as ruthlessness, violence, and pain, trauma, and nostalgia were associated with partition literature written in Bengali in Bangladesh. Likewise, the novels. We have only a few short stories on the great human convulsion of history of the 20th century. The most prominent short story in Bengali is Ekti Tulsi Gacher Atno Kahini, meaning the story of a tulsi plant, was written by Soyod Waliullah. Another popular one is Atnoja or Ekti Korobi Gach, meaning the daughter and an oleander tree by Hassan Azizul Haq. These stories deal with migration and human sufferings from victims' perspective. We can't find that much autobiography as well. Unki Diye Digonto, meaning horizon in pop-up, is an autobiography of writer Hassan Azizul Haq, where we could find the memories of his childhood in India before the partition. Remember what Dr. Fahmidul Haq said about the partition film? Absence of 47. This is the ultimate truth in Bangladesh about the partition. Culturally, nationally, we kept absolute silence about the historical event. And we passed down the practice of oblivion to the generations. If it is not selective amnesia, then what it is? To the best of my knowledge, in last 50 years, focusing 1947, only one song was produced so far. The song was sung by rock musician James. We have another recent song where the partition came as sub-theme. This duet song titled Kanta Tar, meaning the barbed wire, was sung by Indian Bengali singer Nuchiketa and Bangladeshi singer Asif Altaf. Same goes with the theatre. We have one play titled Vibhajan, meaning dividation, written by Ruma Modak. It portrays riot of 1946, partition of 1947, and the migration of Hindu people from East Bengal. Beside this, we could name another theatre titled Bhongo Bongo, meaning the broken Bengal. It was staged by the Bangladeshi famous theatre group Aronok a few years back. In poetry, we could barely remember 3 or 4 poems regarding the partition. Also, in journalism, the partition is a forgotten past. Now, the million-dollar question is, why is it like that? Why is the partition a forgotten past? Why is this totally absent in Bangladeshi popular culture? To know the answer of this why, I interviewed 10 Bangladeshi prominent researchers, academicians, poets, writers, filmmakers, visual artists, singer, and journalists. They are film scholar Dr. Fahmidul Haq, Professor Dr. Said Firdos, researcher Dr. Zillur Rahman Arif, journalist Sabir Mustafa, singer and songwriter Kofil Ahmed, poet and writer Mustaq Ahmed Din, painter Bipul Shah, visual artist Kamruzzaman Shadhin, filmmaker Molla Sagar, and poet and writer Mahbub Aziz. Almost everyone equivocally mentioned that our history has been tamed from nationalist perspective. Also, half of the interviewee stated that in comparison to the liberation war, the partition is a bit distant past for us. Dr. Saeed Firdaus, who did his PhD on the partition, described that, I quote, in our nationalist version of history, we don't go beyond the language movement of 1952. He mentioned that, I quote, we are enthusiastic only about mass upsurge of 1969 and the Liberation War 1971. Quote ends. According to him, I quote, 1971 takes all the talking points while the partition remains as dark chapter in the nationalist academia. Quote ends. We see a reflection of his remark in poet and writer Mahbub Aziz's statement. While interviewed, Mahbub Aziz said, মুক্তিযুদ্ধের তুলনায় partition আমাদের জন্য খানিকটা দূরের ইতিহাস, meaning in comparison to the liberation war, the partition is a bit distant past for us. That is why in our literature we have the abundance of the liberation war and the absence of the partition. Sabir Mustafa, the editor of BBC Bengali News, holds the similar view. While we were talking over a cup of coffee, he described that in comparison to the partition, the violence and bloodshed of 1971 is more intense for Bangladeshi people. That is why the remembrance and relevance of 71 is more common in Bangladeshi. Dr. Fahmidul Haq labeled this as a myopic approach of viewing history. He argues that looking only at the 71 as nearest event by forgetting the partition as a distant past is a narrow and incomplete view of history. Poet and writer Mustaq Ahmed Din offers a completely different view regarding this. He describes that during, I quote, during the partition, those who came to this side from India, almost all of them, one way or the other, were benefited due to the partition. That is why in their write-up, we don't see the wound, pain, and agony of the partition that much. Quote ends. Mulla Sagar also shares the similar view. I am quoting him in Bengali. তাদের তো দেশভাগের কষ্ট নাই, তারা তো দেশ হারায় নাই, দেশ পাইছে, meaning they don't have the pain of dividation because to most of the Muslims, they didn't lose their country, rather they have gained a promised land. Quote ends. Prominent visual artist Vipul Shah was telling that all our great painters such as Joinul Abedin, Kamrul Hassan witnessed the disastrous event. However, they don't have any noteworthy works on the partition. He added that the artists who migrated from the other part of the border, somehow the partition was absent even in the real world. At this point, I would like to remind you, Mia Saman's quoted. Remember what she said about Bangladeshi writer? She wrote, I quote, some writers who witnessed violence choose not to talk about it, while this is generally the case with Bengali writers who ignored the riots to describe the attempt at building a new homeland or on finding a new home. Quote ends. Here, I would like to bring the view of singer and songwriter Kofil Ahmed, who is in denial mode about the partition. Very interesting. He believes state a part of political actions would be divided. However, this is way more deeper in people's life, as he believes Desh is synonymous to culture and people of a land. In his words, I quote, Rashtra ar Desh alada, meaning state and nation are different. He notes, Desh means people, and people are like air, water, river. That is why Kofil believes Desh can't be divided. He also referred state as a black hole. In his words, I quote, state is a black hole. It could swallow you. With this quote, I am almost end of my speech. Before thanking you, let me summarize the main points very quickly. Number one, in Bangladeshi literature and films, we have found very minor representation of the partition. However, it is better than nothing as we see an absolute absence of the event in other popular cultural forms. Beside this, I tried to understand the reasons behind the forgetfulness of the partition. To know the answer, I talked with 10 prominent persons who have gained the authority to make comment on their respective field. The answers that I found could be categorized in 3 different points. The points are, number one, there are scholars who believe that in Bangladesh, we see our history from nationalistic and myopic perspectives. That is why partition is absent in academia and in popular culture. There are people, number two, there are people who believe the wound and massacre from the bloodshed of the liberation war was more intense and still a living memory. That is why the partition is overshadowed by the 1971. Number three, there are people who believe Muslim people who remains in Pakistan during the partition and the Muslims who migrated to this newly born promised land, one way or the other, were benefited economically and socially and were busy making the new nation. So they kept silence about the partition. And that's all from my side. Thank you so very much for your kind attention.